Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. The last episode ended with the Peace of Augsburg, which was a first attempt to settle the issue of religious conflict on the European continent between Catholics and Protestants. If you've ever heard of the 30 Years' War, then you know that the Peace of Augsburg ultimately did not hold. And if you've never heard of the 30 Years' War, you will have heard of it before this episode is through. The problems with the Peace of Augsburg were several. For one thing, while it recognized Lutheranism as a legitimate faith, it didn't do the same for Calvinism or for other new denominations. In Hungary in particular, but also in parts of Burgundy that were soon to become the Netherlands, this lack of recognition of Calvinism was a problem. It also proved to be a problem in Cologne, where the Peace of Augsburg was first seriously tested. You might recall from the previous episode that, according to the Peace of Augsburg, residents of ecclesiastical states were exempted from following the faith of the bishop-elector. Instead, it was agreed in the treaty that bishop-electors changing their religion were required to resign. In Cologne, the archbishop became a Calvinist but refused to resign his office. The result was a short war, and although it ended in a Catholic victory, it pointed out the shortcomings of the Peace of Augsburg. This event occurred in 1556 after Ferdinand became emperor, which happened shortly after the Peace of Augsburg. Early that year, Ferdinand's brother Charles abdicated the imperial throne, exhausted after nearly 40 years of quite eventful rule. On leaving the imperial throne, he also abdicated the throne of Spain. However, in doing so, Charles permanently divided his dominions, leaving Burgundy and Spain, including its massive American empire, to his son Philip. What Charles had done provisionally when he appointed his brother Ferdinand the Archduke of Austria now became a done deal. The sun had set on the world's largest empire being ruled from Vienna. It would now be ruled from Madrid until its extent was surpassed by the empire ruled from London. Ferdinand succeeded Charles as emperor but ruled for less than a decade. During that time, Ferdinand came to a settlement with Hungary and Bohemia and secured Habsburg rule there, at least for a while. Like Charles, Ferdinand also divided his lands among his heirs. His son Maximilian II would become Holy Roman Emperor and would inherit the Archduchy of Lower and Upper Austria, or what is referred to as Austria proper. He would also rule Hungary and Bohemia. Two other sons, Charles and Ferdinand, would rule Inner Austria and Further Austria, respectively. Maximilian II served as emperor and archduke for 12 years, during which he adhered to a general policy of religious tolerance. This was no small feat because the Catholic Church had convened a council in Trent, a city in Tyrol that is now in Italy, to address the Reformation and ultimately launch a counter-Reformation. At Trent, the Church ultimately decided to address corruption in its ranks, but it refused to budge on most doctrinal matters. Maximilian's commitment to tolerance was such that he refused to allow the council's decrees to be published in Austria. Maximilian's toleration was echoed by his son Rudolf. When Rudolf took the throne in 1576, he even extended this toleration to the Jews of Austria. Also, like his predecessors, Rudolf fought the Ottoman Empire. His war with the Turks went on for 13 long years and ended inconclusively. During the war against the Ottomans, Hungary revolted against Rudolf and demanded that his brother and heir, Matthias, be made king of Hungary instead. Rudolf was forced to concede, and to his brother's chagrin, Matthias made peace with the Turks. Outraged, Rudolf tried to restart the war, but with popular support in Hungary, Matthias successfully prevented a reopening of hostilities. Matthias imprisoned Rudolf and forced him to concede his other titles to him. Rudolf died 9 months later. As emperor and archduke, Matthias proved less decisive than his immediate predecessors. Instead, the key figure during Matthias's reign was his chief advisor, Cardinal Melchior Klessel, the Bishop of Vienna. Klessel had been born a Protestant but converted to Catholicism as a teenager and took holy orders as a young adult. Under Rudolf, Klessel had been one of the key figures in the Counter-Reformation, which he pursued with a moderate hand, seeking to make concessions to bring Protestants back into the Catholic Church. Under Matthias, Klessel became a de facto cabinet minister. In this position, he continued to pursue conciliatory policies with the empire's Protestants. For doing so, he incurred the wrath of more conservative monarchs in the emperor's family. Klessel was ultimately arrested and imprisoned in 1618. That year was a monumental one in Austrian history as well as European history overall. It was the year in which the 30 Years' War began. We will get to the war soon, but first we should talk a bit more about the Counter-Reformation and how it unfolded in Austria. While much of the historiography has tended to depict the Counter-Reformation in Austria as the authoritarian reassertion of Catholic domination, Joseph F. Petruch argues in his book entitled A Negotiated Settlement, The Counter-Reformation in Upper Austria under the Habsburgs, that the process was far more extensive and laborious, particularly in Upper Austria. In contrast to the near-uniform Catholicism of the Upper Austrian population immediately following World War I, Protestantism was widespread in Austria by the middle of the 16th century. Protestantism was so well established, according to Petruch, that it constituted the faith of the majority of the population, largely as the result of the area's proximity to the Protestant hotbed of Bohemia. Petruch characterizes the Habsburg monarchy as holding a fundamentally weak position during this period, facing the opposition not only of the predominantly Protestant nobility of Upper Austria, but also of the peasant population. The peasantry had become accustomed to Lutheran innovations in the Mass, such as communion in both kinds, that is, communion consisting of both bread and wine. While lay Catholics had always eaten bread as part of the sacrament of communion, drinking wine was a privilege previously held only by the priest. The Protestant Reformation had allowed congregants to drink wine as well as eat bread, and the new practice was very popular. Virtually all of the rulers of Austria throughout the Reformation had invested heavily in the Church's presence in Austria, creating new parishes and especially monasteries. The monasteries were under the direct control of the crown, but also subject to the authority of the Bishop of Passau, whose see was across the border in Bavaria. Appointed by the Pope, the Bishop of Passau was thus an exemplar of Catholic orthodoxy. In contrast, the peasants fell under the direct political authority of the Herrschaft, a German term referring to the local nobility, many of whom were Protestant. While the Herrschaft was technically subject to rule by Vienna, the nobility nevertheless enjoyed substantial autonomy in local affairs. In addition, the Herrschaft was subordinate to a regional assembly of estates that met in Linz, which by this time was the Upper Austrian capital. The regional assembly in Linz was often in conflict with Vienna over religious questions. As noted previously, as a result of the political situation in Upper Austria, extensive compromise on the part of the crown, as well as the ability to maneuver among multiple levels of political and religious authority, was necessary to reassert Catholic dominance. Since the monasteries were directly under the crown's authority, they provided a natural starting point for the reassertion of Catholic predominance. Petruch writes that when the political situation in Upper Austria changed, quote, "This foundation could and did serve as the basis for establishing Habsburg authority, together with the authority of ecclesiastical representatives allied with them as a component of the Counter-Reformation," end quote. The initial reassertion of orthodoxy took the form of rooting out married clergy. Under the influence of the Reformation, the clergy in Austria had taken to breaking its vows of celibacy at an alarming rate. Therefore, the campaign against married and sexually active clergy took up much of the first decades of the Counter-Reformation. Although this measure was met with substantial resistance by the clergy and peasantry both, Petruch argues that the promise of the withdrawal of new rights enjoyed by women during the Reformation offered an incentive for certain local and clerical authorities to give up their resistance. However, it was only after the crushing of the Bohemian Revolt in 1620, a point to which we will return shortly, that the Protestant nobility in Upper Austria was sufficiently cowed for the crown's Counter-Reformation efforts to escalate. The Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War ultimately settled the matter, but we're not yet there. As noted, the Counter-Reformation in the Habsburg hereditary lands was ultimately quite successful, if religious affiliation in the early 20th century is any metric. However, the greatest threat to Catholic dominance in Austria was neither Martin Luther nor the Schmalkaldic League, which, as we established in the last episode, was the military alliance of Protestant notables within the Holy Roman Empire. Rather, it was a revolt in Bohemia that engulfed the continent. It's time again to define a term. Today's word is defenestration, which is the act of throwing someone out a window. Prague, the capital of Bohemia, has seen more than its share of these events. The first defenestration occurred in 1419, when Hussites attacked members of the Prague City Council and killed 7 people by throwing them out of windows from the town hall. It happened again in 1483 when Hussites once again killed 7 city councilors at the town hall. The most recent defenestration happened in 1948 when the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia, John Marasek, fell from a bathroom window of the Foreign Affairs Ministry. 75 years later, it remains unclear whether Marasek's death was a suicide or murder. Arguably, the most significant defenestration of Prague occurred on May 23, 1618. The story begins with rumors of closures of Protestant churches in Bohemia. In his 2017 article entitled Defenestration as Ritual Punishment, published in the Journal of Modern History, the historian Daniel Juda describes events thus. In the spring of 1618, this led to an official complaint from the Protestant estates to Emperor Matthias in Vienna. The emperor, however, brusquely dismissed the complaint and forbade the delegates of the Protestant estates to assemble for any political council in the future. Bohemians reacted indignantly to this news, suspecting that the forces desiring the re-Catholicization of the Kingdom of Bohemia had gained the upper hand among the Habsburgs. Fears of this nature had been festering for some time. Juda continues, disregarding the ban on assembly, the representatives of the Protestant estates gathered in Prague to discuss their course of action. After 2 days of deliberations on May 23, 1618, a group of roughly 200 estate representatives set out for Prague Castle, the center of Habsburg rule in Bohemia. End quote. 2 Catholic regents met the protesters inside the castle. Juda writes, assembled in the chamber of the Bohemian Council, the Protestant representatives read out their protest message. The 2 regents then had the opportunity to defend themselves, and predictably they rejected the grievances. But their spurious arguments, which were little more than delaying tactics, did not convince the Protestants, who immediately proceeded to an ad hoc trial. The verdict was that the 2 men should be brought to justice. End quote. So the 2 men were thrown from the nearest windows, as was a secretary who was present. All 3 men survived, by the way, having fallen into a pile of manure, but the damage was done. The Habsburgs would have to respond, and they did. 2 years of war followed, but with a Catholic victory, Bohemia would remain under Habsburg control until World War I. However, although the revolt in Bohemia was over, the 30 Years' War had just begun. It would be difficult to overestimate just how cataclysmic this war would prove to be. Some estimates state that up to 1/3 of the German-speaking population of Europe died between 1618 and 1648. Perhaps as many as 8 million people, both soldiers and civilians, died in the war. It is likely that no single war was as costly in terms of lives lost until World War I. The only upside to all of this destruction was that the war would finally settle once and for all the issue of religion in Central Europe. After 1648, Europe would enter a new age of reason based in part on the end of religious conflict. With victory over the Bohemians, the attention of the Habsburgs would turn now to the Palatinate, and that's where we'll pick up in the next episode. Thanks for listening.